This is the Moral Science Podcast, and I'm your host, Amber Cazell. In this series, I get to interview experts in my favorite subject, the scientific study of human morality, virtues and vices, evolution of morals, the judgment-action gap, character development, the philosophy of morality, transcendent experiences, researchers' moral biases, cultural values, plus the obligatory trolley dilemma. We are going to talk about it all. Dr. Kiley Hamlin is an associate professor of psychology and the Canadian Research Chair at the University of British Columbia. There she directs the Center for Infant Cognition, where she examines the developmental origins of moral judgments in preverbal babies and young toddlers. She is the recipient of numerous awards and grants from the Association for Psychological Science, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, and the John Templeton Foundation, among others. In this episode, we discuss her research which illuminates when and how babies express the earliest forms of a moral sense.
So baby methods are grounded in the idea that babies don't actually do very many complex things. So you have to figure out a way to access what they're thinking and feeling in very simple ways that they're, capable, behaviors that they're capable of expressing, essentially. So people tend to use patterns of attention to different kinds of stimuli. So does a baby look longer at this kind of event versus that kind of event, or this character versus that character? If they do so reliably at a group level, you might be able to make inferences about what drives their understanding or their preferences for different events and characters.
Mm-hmm.
So what we do to study helping versus harming, or in the early cases, we looked at what we would really call helping versus hindering. So sort of helping someone get their goal versus preventing them from getting their goal. The first study that we did, we showed babies the same two events over and over again until babies become what we say officially bored or habituated to the events. So basically we showed them a little climbing character with eyes, and the character looked up a hill, moved to the middle of the hill, and then was unable to climb up any further. So he would try and fall back down and try and fall back down. And on one kind of event, on helping events, another little character would come and push him by bumping him twice to the top of the hill. And then the character would sort of go back down the hill, and the climber character would be at the top, sort of achieving his goal. Whereas on other events, the hindering events, a third character would come, bump the climber down the hill, preventing him from getting his goal, and he would go back up the hill and off the stage. So basically, we just showed babies these climbing and helping and hindering events over and over again until they were bored with them. And all we can reason about what babies do when they're bored is that, well, they're not interested in getting anything more out of this event than they've already gotten out of it. So, if they've learned something about it, we should now be able to test them on that learning. Or maybe they haven't learned anything about it. They're just tired of looking at it. But either way, we can't get them to watch it anymore. So we sort of move on at that point once they're officially bored.
Mm-hmm.
After we show them those events over and over again and they're officially bored, what we did was simply provided them with a choice between the helpful and hindering character. So a research assistant who didn't know which character had done what that day, because importantly, we always vary the color of who did what and the side of where they are in order to make sure that, color or side is not influencing infants' preferences.
Mm-hmm.
But so a research assistant who doesn't know which character is which comes out and offers the two characters to babies on a board and just says, who do you like, or who do you want to play with?
Mm-hmm.
And we just see which one the babies touch first.
Okay.
And based on that, we infer that this baby preferred or liked or wanted to interact with or was more interested in. Any kind of explanation will do. the character that they touched.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. It sounds so complicated because when I think about, my own kids as babies, it's like so hard to figure out what they're thinking or doing in any one circumstance that it's impressive. I mean, it's great. It's impressive that you're able to systematically pull these things off. Like how long does it usually take to finagle with methods to get something that works in babies that are, paying attention in the first place, like even the first time you play the video,
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really depends on the study. So some studies, it takes a long time to figure out what is interesting enough that babies will sit through it, but not too interesting that they're overwhelmed. And, need to stop the study before you finish showing them everything. So it's certainly a balance that, piloting your methods on a few real life babies helps immensely sort of figure out what your average baby is going to be interested in and bored by and all of that kind of stuff. But one thing that we found with the methods with the helping and hindering events is that babies were surprisingly into it. So they sort of watch these events very intently, perhaps because in our original studies, the events were happening actually not on video, but acted out right in front of them. So in sort of live 3D stereo, these characters were interacting. And what we found is that babies at, around 6 months just sort of couldn't get enough of it. They were really, really quite interested in the events and would watch lots of events happily because they just found them so engaging, which I think is a sort of interesting finding in itself, that babies were so interested in watching these characters they've never seen before that are not human or even animals interact and sort of really responding to them as though they were sort of rapt audience members.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit to specifically how this gets applied to morality. So in this paper, and for people who are listening to the podcast, I'll link to it in the episode description, but the paper that Kiley and I are largely going to start working from today is Infants and Young Children's Preferences for Prosocial over Antisocial Others in Human Development. Kiley published this with Julia van de Vondervoort in 2018. And anyway, I really appreciated the time that was taken in this article to kind of unravel how you identify a moral sense in infants, since it's already, and you even acknowledge this in the paper, it's already difficult enough to do so in adults. And then you start to add in some of these these interpretive complexities. And so you mentioned like 4 different elements. One was that the moral sense, trying to unravel what is a moral sense in infants, involves social agents and a differential attention to social agents. You can see these reactions in unrelated third parties. There's attention paid to the intention of the agents involved, and that it's like contextually sensitive. So I'd love to kind of unpack these one at a time.
Sure.
And so the first one you mentioned was that the moral sense has to involve evaluations in situations where there's a social agent. Could you tell me a bit about some of the studies that have been done around that and what that means?
Sure. Yeah. So, of course, the sense that, helping others is better than harming them requires that you're doing something to others who are worthy of being helped and harmed. So, for example, in our Hill study that I mentioned a little while ago, we had control conditions where characters with eyes, the same characters who'd been the helper and the hinderer in the original study, pushed a ball up and down a hill. So rather than pushing a character who was an agent who had previously shown the goal of getting to the top of the hill, there was just an inert ball and it was pushed up versus pushed down. And what we found is that babies didn't prefer the character who pushed the ball upward versus the character who pushed the ball downward. suggesting that their preference in the other condition was, specific to a social interaction. So if similar actions are taken on inanimate objects, babies don't seem to show a preference for characters who do one thing versus another. We've done that same kind of control condition in various other puppet shows that we've shown to babies with positive and negative social action. So in one study, we have a character's playing with a ball, and he systematically drops his ball. And every time it falls in front of one puppet, that puppet is nice and sort of rolls his ball back to him. And every time the ball drops in front of another puppet, that puppet is mean and steals the ball away. So in that study, rather than pushing up versus pushing down being the sort of actions needing controlling for, we controlled for the idea of rolling a ball toward the center of the stage versus running off the stage with a ball. And we had characters who interacted with, rather than a puppet who was, playing with a ball, a stick that had a ball attached to the end. And the ball would sort of bounce up and down, and it would drop in front of one character or another, one of whom would roll the ball back, one of whom would steal the ball away. And again, in those studies, we found babies did not systematically prefer the character who rolled the ball back. So across studies, we've found essentially that babies care about these kinds of actions only when they're directed toward an agent that has an unfulfilled goal. So only when they're real instances of helping and harming, essentially.
Interesting. And at what age at what age do you start to see that distinction happening?
So we've actually found that distinction at every age at which we've looked at these capacities. So the two studies that I just described, we've found that 3-month-old babies will prefer a helpful versus a unhelpful character in the social conditions when those actions are directed toward an agent, but that babies at the same age, so in this case 3 months, will not prefer a character who does the same physical action but toward a non-agent. So in the non-social conditions.
Yeah.
So we haven't ever found an age group where babies will prefer a helper over a hinderer, but seemingly because of the sort of low-level features of the displays. Because every time we've asked them these control questions about whether it needs to be directed towards a social being, we've always found that the answer is yes.
That's pretty mind-blowing. I mean,
yeah, it's pretty amazing.
It really is. Okay, interesting. So, I mean, the second thing that you mentioned as kind of helping tease apart whether or not this is related to a moral sense was that infants care about these things happening in third parties. And that seems to largely be baked into all of the studies that you do. Is that kind of fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. So you could imagine showing that an infant prefers others who help versus harm themselves. And that wouldn't necessarily be particularly surprising. So, I might like those who give balls to me. I might like those who help me get up a hill if I can't get up by myself, for selfish reasons that are about my own benefit. But so we've actually always done our studies in the third party context with the idea that if babies care about these things, they should, like adults, care about them in situations in which they do not stand to immediately benefit or suffer from the interactions. So they're sort of never seen these characters before, they're observing them from afar. Nevertheless, they seem to generate evaluations of the characters engaging in the behaviors.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. And you mentioned at one point some studies that were aimed at trying to tease apart whether something is just sort of a egoistic learning that might result in what looks like moral evaluations. Was that your work or was that somebody else's? It had to do with like puppets offering crackers, I think it was.
Yeah, so this wasn't my work. This was work
Okay.
by Arbor Tassimi and Karen Wynn. So Arbor came after me in the Wynn lab at Yale, and he's actually just starting an assistant professorship at Emory University.
Oh, cool.
But so what he did is he showed babies a different puppet show than what I've described to you before, but it's our sort of third most common show, where there's a character and there's a box with a toy inside of it, and the character is trying but failing to open a box to get the toy out. So he sort of tries and struggles with the lid of the box a bunch of times, and then on alternating events, he is helped. Somebody comes and jumps on the lid of the box and opens it with him for the protagonist. And he's also hindered. Another character comes and jumps on the box and slams it shut, preventing the character from getting his toy. So Arbor showed babies this puppet show where there's a helper and a hinderer. And then he had the characters offer the babies cookies or graham crackers. And what he found is that when characters offered the same number of graham crackers, that babies preferred the helper like usual. And they preferred the helper even when the helper offered 2 graham crackers, whereas they prefer the helper even when the helper offered only 1 graham cracker, whereas the hinderer offered 2. So essentially, it seemed like babies were willing to give up a single cracker in order to avoid interacting with the hinderer.
Right. That's also pretty crazy. I'm just consistently blown away by like how young some of these tendencies are emerging. Do you remember what the age group was for that sort of behavior?
I'm fairly sure that was 12-month-olds as opposed to the younger ones, because basically babies, don't eat graham crackers
Right.
Until later in their first year. So you're sort of a bit limited on when you can start introducing foods and other benefits to babies. But essentially found that 12-month-olds were willing to give up a cracker to not interact with a hinderer.
Yeah.
Interestingly, before you're too impressed by the babies, they also found that babies, when they were choosing between a hinderer who offered 8 crackers and a helper who only offered 1, then babies were sort of non-systematic in their preferences. So, Tassimi and Wynn suggests that there might be a point at which you can buy infants' preference, but at least all else equal, they prefer a helper. And even when the hinderer offers some benefit to the baby more than the helper, they will still prefer a helper.
Yeah. That's funny about buying off. I mean, seems like adults do that too. So
indeed, yeah. So certainly there is a point at which anyone can be bribed, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm also curious about sort of this aspect of infant sensitivity to the intention of sort of the agents involved, and how that plays into their preferences.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is probably the question that we've been most interested in. Once we established that babies like helpers, we wanted to understand what about the helpful actions they were liking. So there are many ways to think about action, but one clear way to divide up different components of action is into the thing that ends up happening, the outcome, and the intention that drove the action. And in all of the studies I've told you about so far, the helper intends to help and successfully helps, so it's a good outcome. And the hinderer intends to harm and successfully hinders, and so it's a bad outcome for the protagonist, not for the baby, as I've said in the past, but for the protagonist. So in all the previous studies that I've described, the intention to help and the outcome of a protagonist being helped are confounded. So The helper intends to help and causes the protagonist to get his goal, and the hinderer intends to harm and prevents the protagonist from getting his goal. So in the studies that we've done since, over the last 10 years plus, we have started to look at situations in which intention and outcome are deconfounded. So, for example, when someone tries to help but fails versus someone tries to hinder but fails, in this case, the positive outcome for the protagonist actually happens during hindering events. So if someone tries to hinder but isn't able to, the protagonist does get his goal. So it's a bad intention combined with a positive outcome. And in the failed helper situation, a helper positively intends to help but fails to do so, so the outcome is bad. So in studies where we pit intention and outcome in those kinds of ways, we found that, in fact, babies from 8 months of age, although potentially not before that, prefer characters who try to help. Seem to evaluate others based on the intentions to be helpful towards others rather than the outcomes of actually being helpful towards others. We've looked at the distinction between intention and outcome in several other ways. We've looked at accidents. So when someone causes a good or bad outcome, but without having intended to do so. And we found that at 10 months, babies will prefer a character who intended to help over one who accidentally helped. And they will also prefer a character who accidentally hindered over one who intended to hinder. As though, again, they think that the intention is the important thing, and having positive intentions is good, and having negative intentions is bad.
Yeah. That's, again, just surprising to me that they're even able to pick up on the concept of intentions at that age. That's really cool.
Yeah, so other studies in the literature just about what babies understand about people's goals and intentions more generally also find that around 8 to 10 months is where babies start to understand situations in which somebody intends something but doesn't achieve it, or somebody accidentally does something that they didn't intend. So in fact, the findings suggested that at that same time in development, when babies are starting to understand situations in general when intention and outcome don't match up, they also use that understanding to inform their preferences for helpers and hinderers.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so then the last element in this paper that you discussed was also this concept of contextual sensitivity, which it sounds like intentions is a little bit, it is kind of related to as well.
It's definitely related, yeah.
Yeah, so like what other sorts of contexts do babies seem to be paying attention to with respect to seeming moral evaluations?
So in these studies, I'm generally referring to the work that we've done, asking what babies think of those who help versus harm, those who've already helped or harmed someone else. So for example, in our daily lives, we generally think helping is good. And we also certainly think that those who've helped others deserve to be helped themselves. However, when we are encountering someone who's previously harmed others, we are less sure about what should happen to them. And indeed, sometimes we think that they should be treated badly or punished for their misdeeds.
Mm-hmm.
So in a very simplified version of reward and punishment, we showed babies two kinds of puppet shows in the same study. So babies would first see a character who has an unfulfilled goal, say to open a box. One character, the helper, would help him, and another character, the hinderer, would prevent him from getting the goal. And then in the second kind of puppet show that babies would see, they would see either the helper from phase one or the hinderer from phase one. And this character would have a different unfulfilled goal. So he would lose his ball, essentially. So really, we just combined two of the puppet shows that I've described in more detail already. And essentially we asked whether when they're looking at a character who was previously nice, do they like someone who gives a nice guy his ball back versus takes a nice guy's ball away? And indeed, we find that babies do show that preference. So they prefer those who are nice to nice guys, although that's not that surprising because they prefer those who are nice to everyone in the studies we've shown them before.
Mm-hmm.
So the key condition was, what do babies think when someone is nice versus mean to someone who has already hindered somebody else? So towards a bad guy, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And what we found was actually quite surprising to us. We found that babies didn't seem confused by this situation. It didn't seem like there was some kind of competition between them generally thinking taking is bad, but not sure that the previously mean character should get, rewarded or have his ball given back to him. Instead, we found that babies were very likely to prefer the character who took the ball from the previously harmful character. So it's like they like someone who was mean to someone who was mean before.
Wow.
So when we talk about context, in this case, it's sort of like, do babies take into account why someone acted the way that they did? And one reason that somebody might act sort of traditionally antisocially is because they're doing it towards someone who deserves it, who's done something bad or needs to be punished or maybe needs protection or something like that. And indeed, we found that babies as early as 4.5 months of age will evaluate actions in context in this way, and like someone who's nice to somebody nice, but like someone who's mean to somebody mean.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting work. And when I was reading through the paper towards the end, you also kind of mention, just broadly speaking, started to situate some of these sprouts or intuitions as from sort of this evolutionary functional perspective. And it got me thinking a bit about Oliver Scott Curry's theory of morality as cooperation. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, it got me thinking about that. And I'm curious now if you've considered researching some of those other lesser studied, at least to my knowledge, lesser studied sorts of cooperations, like do babies distinguish between like different types of treatment of familial ties versus not? Like if a puppet had a baby, is the puppet supposed to treat the baby differently than it's supposed to treat a stranger, and that sort of a thing?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and one that we have not asked in particular, but there's hints of these questions being answered in the rest of the field. So I can tell you about 2 pieces of evidence that I think are relevant to this question. Yeah. One is that babies seem to be able to reason about familial ties. So, for example, they can detect that a caregiver who preferentially cares for one baby and a different caregiver who also preferentially cares for that one baby, they should be sort of affiliated with each other. In addition, if 2 babies are cared for by the same caregiver, babies think that they should be affiliated with each other. So they seem to have some basic understanding of how caregiving structures social relationships. And that is all work that is by Annie Spokes. And she has done just quite a lot of work with her advisor, Liz Spelke, on babies' understanding of caregiving.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah,
it's wild, but it sort of makes some conceptual sense, right? Like if we have these innate moral sprouts, kind of as you're referring to, kind of the reference to Mencius's concept of sprouts. If we have these sprouts, then we should expect to see them tracking with these functional accounts of morality. Are you aware of anything else, or have you done anything else with respect to some of those tendencies. I'm trying to think of what else there was. I know there were like a hawkish and dovish conflict resolution things. I don't know how that would work with
yeah.
babies, but.
So there's definitely work, mainly by Renee Bayer-Jean and her colleagues, that has looked at whether babies think that group members are sort of required to help each other or not. So one thing that we generally find is that babies don't seem to find at baseline helping events any more interesting or boring than harming events. So one hypothesis you might have is maybe babies see helping all the time in their daily lives. And so they come into the lab and they see harming and they're like, oh my gosh, that's very surprising. And I don't like it. But in fact, we seem to find that babies have the I don't like it response to harming, but they don't seem to find it surprising. Or at least we found that they will overall look equally long at random helping versus random hindering or harming events. However, it does seem like once you throw group level information into the situation, that babies may then develop expectations for how others will treat each other. So babies, it turns out, will be surprised if two in-group members harm each other, and or fail to help each other, whereas they won't be surprised if two individuals who are not a member of the same group harm each other or fail to help each other. So it seems like babies' expectations for how social interactions are supposed to go are specific to, who is a group member with whom. So this might also turn out to be the case in the case of, family groups, so kin, things like that. But I'm not aware of studies that have looked at that in particular.
Yeah, that's really neat. It's satisfying to see research and theory coalescing so well. So I'm curious now, like taking all this together, as you've dedicated your career to this, what are some of the takeaways for you about what researching infants can tell us about morality broadly, the nature of morality broadly?
Yeah, that's a really, that is the question. So thank you for asking, but, I'm not sure I can do it particularly, do it justice. I guess from my perspective, I think that in order to understand any sort of system of, cognition and action in humans, we need to understand where it came from. And presumably, morality is based on many things, certainly one of them being teaching from parents and teachers, another one being sort of our own personal experiences with the kinds of interactions that go well and the kinds of interactions that go poorly. We might also just observe others having positive versus negative interactions in the world and learn about good and bad things from those. So the work with babies is not designed to say that, all of morality is present in the first few months of life, far from it. But it's just asking questions about whether babies come to those learning experiences, which are critical, with any sort of preconceptions or sort of tendencies toward carving up the world in a particular way or evaluating the world in a particular way. And so I think that the work to date, not just my work, but work of many people in this field, including a whole large body of work on babies' understanding of fairness and how resources should be distributed in the world, that basically babies may come to those experiences with some preconceptions about how things should go or how things tend to go.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, does it give you any sense of, does it give you any intuitive sense of the strengths and weaknesses of some of the broader theories of morality and psychology? So I'm thinking like social domains theory or moral foundations theory, or even like
Yeah.
Oliver Scott Curry's theory.
Sorry, what was the last one?
Even like the Oliver Scott Curry's theory that we were discussing earlier of morality.
Right. I think Oliver Scott Curry's theory shares a lot of commonalities with moral foundations theory, sort of saying that there's a potentially universal tendency to engage in particular kinds of moral thinking or to see particular actions as good or bad. And I would say that theoretically speaking, our work with babies is most commensurate with those kinds of theories, that essentially there is some kind of first draft of morality in the human mind that has led to commonalities across vastly diverse cultures in what people think are, good and bad ways to act. So in contrast, other kinds of theories of moral development have looked more at sort of patterns of reasoning about morality versus other social domains, as in social domain theory, and or patterns of reasoning about different moral domains based on what kinds of experiences children have had or sort of what things they've been taught, et cetera. And sort of those focus more on the kind of learning that is absolutely happening in the first few years of life, based on particular experiences that children have, based on cognitive developments in other domains that allow for increasingly sophisticated thought within the moral domain. But I would say that our work with babies suggesting that they're doing something relatively more sophisticated than we ever would have thought previously with respect to the moral domain is more consistent with the sort of more functional evolutionary theories of where morality comes from.
Yeah. That sparks a few more questions for me. So
sure.
Do babies seem to distinguish between, like social domains theory, a lot of that research seems to focus on just being able to delineate moral issues or like harm issues from social conventions. Do babies show any signs of distinguishing between social convention and moral issues?
So there has not been nearly as much work on the sort of conventional versus moral in babies. Although, the definition of morality within social domain theory is that it only involves issues of harm and issues of fairness. So any of the studies that I've been talking to you about with, for example, how different group members should interact, would be about the conventional domain within that theory. So, but there has been far less things sort of saying, here's a conventional violation, here's a moral violation, and how do babies think about this? There's definitely stuff with older toddlers. So 2 and 3-year-olds and preschoolers will, for example, if they see someone acting inappropriately, they might be more likely to call it out if it's a group member of theirs acting inappropriately, when it's something that is traditionally considered conventional versus traditionally considered moral. So certainly there's work by Marco Schmidt and colleagues suggesting that at least maybe older 2s, 3s, preschoolers will selectively protest against moral harms rather than conventional ones. Suggesting that indeed potentially the distinction between moral and conventional is early developing, although I think potentially not quite as early developing as 3 to 6 months.
Yeah. I'm curious too about like the sort of those 4 indicators of a moral sense that we were talking about, the social agents, third parties, intentions, and context. Do you think that those are adequately able to distinguish between convention and morality? Like, could you run a similar experiment to the ones that you have about a norm violation and have, I mean, I guess picking up on norms takes time in the first place, right? For an infant. So I'm not sure.
Right. We would first have to establish a norm to then violate it. But that is certainly something that could potentially be done. And then we might want to ask about whether those 4 characteristics that I talked about also influence babies' judgments in that particular violation, which would be a really great way to get at the question. Yeah. We haven't done anything like that to date, but it sounds like a great idea. So thank you.
Yeah. And then on the moral foundation side, you've done a lot with, or at least, you've done a lot with harm kind of stuff, and or at least pro-sociality and anti-sociality, which seems like harm to me. And then I believe fairness as well. And at least I know there's a lot on fairness.
So it's mostly not been us, but folks like Jessica Somerville and Lucas Durian have done quite a lot of work on fairness, suggesting that babies have a sophisticated understanding of fair versus unfair. Renee Barjan's group as well has studied a lot about babies' understanding and evaluation of fairness.
Yeah. And then you mentioned that there's a little bit that's been done on like the beginnings of in-group, out-group type of stuff. Are there, what about the other 2 foundations, like hierarchy and like purity?
Yeah, so there are a few papers on hierarchy. So these papers are by Francesco Margoni, Lucas Durian, and Renee Barjan. And they've looked at whether babies think that those who sort of gather their power by a consensus are going to treat individuals in a particular way versus those who gather their power via sort of harming others. So it's looked at things like sort of dominance versus prestige-based hierarchy systems. And so as far as I know, there's one paper looking at babies' understanding of those things, finding positive results, I believe, in toddlers. There's also been work suggestive that babies will evaluate characters who are either dominant or submissive, depending on the age. So actually, it looks like younger babies seem to prefer submissive individuals, whereas by the time you hit toddlerhood, you prefer dominant individuals. And by submissive versus dominant, I mean 2 characters try to get across the stage and one of them gets out of the way for the other one so he can get through. And so, again, babies seem to prefer the character who gets out of the way for the other character to get through. And toddlers seem to prefer the character who wins and gets through. So interesting that there's a developmental change there, but it does seem to be robust. And that's work by Ashley Thomas and her colleagues.
Interesting. Very cool. And so for you personally, what are some of your next steps for your own research? What are you starting to explore now?
Yeah, so we're increasingly interested in understanding better the mechanisms of what's going on when babies are showing these preferences that we believe that they show. So we're doing this in 2 ways. We're looking at a more mechanistic level. We're looking at things like where exactly do babies look when they're watching these helpful and harmful events, and how do babies' looking behaviors predict their preferences? And in one study, for example, we found that babies who attend selectively to the character's goal are most likely to prefer the character who helps with the goal. So this is potentially not that surprising, but it turns out that you need to be able to process what the character intends to do before you can like someone who helps him do it. We have also, at this sort of more mechanistic level, been trying to explore babies' emotions and whether emotion experience during these events has anything to do with babies' preferences. Yeah. So far, we've been able to show, using a couple of different methods, that indeed babies look happier after they see helping versus after they see hindering. We have yet to be able to tie these results to individual babies' preferences or sort of establish a causal connection between emotional experiences and preference for helpers, but we're working on those kinds of questions right now. Again, just trying to explore like what mechanisms underlie these tendencies. Yeah. The third thing that we're looking at is trying to understand what these tendencies in babies mean for the individual development of the child. So, for example, are babies who prefer the helper actually showing evidence of a precursor to morality? And one way of asking that question is to see, okay, well, how quote unquote moral does this child seem later in life? For example, a child who was more versus less likely to prefer helpers as an infant. We're currently in the midst of a very large longitudinal study asking this question, but that study is very much not finished yet, and also COVID might make it, or has made it much harder to complete, and so we're working on it. But we do have one paper out that was an opportunity sample where we simply just like happened to find a bunch of babies who'd done multiple infant studies during their very early years. And we were able to check whether their tendency to prefer helpers or respond in the hypothesized direction during infancy related to features of their social moral development. And essentially what we found is that in particular, there were links between babies' tendency to prefer helpers and their parents' tendency to report that they had lower callous and unemotional traits in preschool. Wow. So I want to say again that this was an opportunity sample. It was a relatively small sample. And so we're currently trying to do this study right and see whether those kinds of effects hold up. But it was suggestive evidence that we are studying something about moral development, exactly what feature of moral development it is that we're studying and how it's going to relate to how kids turn out across the very broad domain of moral development remains to be seen. But that was some exciting sort of suggestive evidence that we may be studying early moral development here.
Wow, that's so cool. Well, Kiley, thank you so much for your time. I have thoroughly enjoyed getting to learn about the ins and outs of all of this baby research and what has and hasn't been studied. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. This is really fun.
Thanks for listening. If you have questions, comments, suggestions, or requests, contact me at www.moralsciencepodcast.com. The Moral Science Podcast is sponsored by ERA Inc., a research and design think tank that's reinventing how people interact with each other. Music throughout the program is My Kruby by Kindswider and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.